thank you to all of you for joining us to discuss how we can tackle climate change and sustainability challenges whilst adhering to the horizontal, but let's see also other rules of the game. My name is Anna Lyle-Smythe. I'm a partner at Slaughter & May. I'm going to ask shortly each of our panellists to introduce themselves before I give a bit more of an introduction to our topic. I've also asked all our panellists to give a short sustainability story of their own so that we can just try and kick off this panel with a bit more of a personal reflection. I'm going to give one of my own to start things off, which is that I grew up in London to a Finnish mother, spending all of my holidays in Finland, and found very quickly that Finland was well ahead of the UK on the sustainability and recycling agenda. And so whether it be learning to start recycling when I was a child, how we were recycling, and indeed what methods we use. And every time I seem to go back to Finland, there's something new. So for me personally, I'm delighted to see if Kirsi is going to show us again that on competition law as well, Finland is ahead of the curve. So with that, I will hand over to Kirsi to introduce herself.
Good morning, everybody. I'm the Director General of the Finnish Competition and Consumer Authority. I have also worked for the legal service of the European Commission in the competition team and also in private sector in a law firm. As regards my personal sustainability story, so when I started as the Director General 2 years ago, I first took part in an intensive training course on economic policy, which is organized for public and private sector leaders in Finland. And the course was on economic policy, but it has a special focus on sustainability. And I believe actually that the same course which is held each year has inspired many political and business leaders in Finland to be active in the area of sustainability. In the course we heard top professionals and professors who presented us deeply very hard facts about climate change and proposals as to what should be done and how fast. And I believe that after the course, it was clear to each participant that each one of us has a deep moral responsibility for future generations to do in our own field of practice all that is possible to save this planet. And then I started to think that, is there anything that could be done in my field about competition and consumer policy? And with this in mind, I looked with fresh eyes how climate issues are dealt with in competition law. And I then started to think that there might be a potential in allowing competitors to work more closely together to combat climate change, or at least that this should be further explored.
Thank you. Dina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Dina Lurje, and I'm the Deputy Chairwoman of the Lithuanian Competition Agency. I've previously been the head of the Anti-Competitive Agreements Division, and I've been also supervising it for a number of years. The sustainability story, that was a thing I was thinking about the most when I was preparing for this. But then at the end of the day, I decided to say that I think that the real sustainability story is taking place in my home now, as that's where most of us are spending our time. And it's just trying to teach my kid just some sustainability enhancing habits that honestly were not part of my upbringing at all. So I think this is my my very first step in that.
Great, thank you. Maria.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Maria Jaspers. Since a few days only, I'm now the director in the cartel directorate in DG Comp. When I agreed to sign up to this panel, I was heading the antitrust policy in DG Comp. I think my sustainability story is a little bit similar to what Dina just said. I think one of the beauties of having raised a very environmental conscious 12-year-old who's far more into sustainability issues than I was at his age, despite my Scandinavian upbringing, is that there is a peer pressure on a constant basis to reduce plastic consumption in our house. And as I am dragging up 12 kilos of bottled glass, bottled water up the many stairs in my little townhouse, I'm of course praying that the magic of competition will soon kick in and that we will have, so to speak, environmental friendly drinking water, or at least a better recycling system also in the Belgium.
Thank you. Suzanne. Suzanne, you might be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, excellent. Hi, I'm Professor Suzanne, Kingston Professor at University College Dublin, and I'm also Barrister Senior Counsel at the Irish Bar. I have been so interested in this topic, so delighted that it is coming to the fore now. I published a book on greening European competition law and policy back in 2011. Pretty much when this was not on the radar, so I'm so delighted it's coming to the fore of the policy agenda in recent months. In terms of my own sustainability thoughts from the past months, I have to say one of the things that has made a huge difference for me in sustainability terms, and I think is really a good thing going forward, is just the hearings before the Court of Justice in Luxembourg for the first time now have been taking place. You can participate remotely, which is a massive change for us in Ireland, where normally we would be taking flights all the time. And it has been working generally really well. So again, I think this pandemic has actually led to some kind of change that actually could be permanent and beneficial, certainly in terms of emissions of us all flying to Luxembourg for the hearing. So that was my story.
Great, thank you. And Anneleen?
Hi, I'm Anneleen Straetemans. I'm currently the head of legal and corporate affairs for Europe at ZX Ventures. ZX Ventures is the innovation and startup arm of AB InBev, one of the largest brewers in the world. My sustainability story is, well, one is it's a piece of pride as a Belgian, is that one of our Belgian brewmasters, he worked on a project to try and reduce the carbon footprint in brewing beer. And it's an innovation that we launched last year that we are sharing with other brewers around the world, which results in a massive reduction of carbon emissions when brewing beer.
Wonderful. Well, this is good on many levels. So that's great to hear. And thank you all for sharing your stories. I think it's something Suzanne already picked up, but this topic, I think, really is a great one. It would have been a fascinatingly interesting one in March, I'm sure. But the last few months, everything in our world has changed, and some things for the worse, clearly, but some things for the better. And for me, one of the things that's changed is that this COVID crisis has really accelerated the discussion about sustainability and the importance of protecting and securing the future of our planet. On the competition law front, we haven't been standing by either over this change. And we've seen just a couple of big changes in the few months since we were due to have this panel in person. The Dutch Competition Authority, of course, launching some guidelines on cooperation in benefit of sustainability, and of course the ongoing EC consultation on the same topic. We'll try and pick up on those during the session, but I think there's just so much to talk about, so we should get started. Without trying to go back to basics, but nonetheless thinking it's quite an important thing just to set ourselves in the right place for this panel, we thought we would start with a question, which I'll pose to Kirsi and to Anneleen, which is, what do we mean by sustainability? What is this? Kirsi, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we are today focusing on climate change, even though it is not the only area of sustainability. I think it is very important that we make a clear distinction between environmental sustainability agreements and other types of sustainability agreements as regards how we interpret competition law. With environmental sustainability agreements, I mean especially those agreements that aim at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Other sustainability agreements include a variety of different other important goals, and like agreements to enhance animal welfare, or to combat child labor, or to improve working conditions. And I, of course, do not mean to undermine the importance of other sustainability issues, but climate policy stands alone as by far the most important policy objective of the world today. Climate change is the biggest market failure ever, presents very serious global risks, and demands an urgent global response.
Anneleen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I fully agree with Kirsi. I would add though that when we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are a couple, in addition to everything related to biodiversity and climate change, that I think, as we are thinking now about how antitrust fits into solving these challenges, I think there's other areas where if we find a good framework for that, like how do we apply antitrust to sustainability challenges, that will, I think, in time also come into scope, right? And I'm thinking about the goals related to good health, gender equality, decent working conditions. There's also innovation infrastructure, responsible consumption. I think, especially from a business side, those are challenges that we're tackling as well, and where we face similar antitrust issues as when we are partaking in initiatives related to climate change. So I agree that climate change is a very good place to start to really think through how do we apply antitrust to challenges like that. But I also want to be conscious of the fact that the framework that antitrust authorities are thinking up now should be more broadly applicable, because there's these other areas where similar challenges will present themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we talked a bit about this kind of interaction between COVID and what it's done. I don't know, Kirsi, how you've seen that in terms of its impact on this discussion.
Well, I think it's very interesting to compare climate crisis to COVID crisis. In COVID crisis, all the authorities reacted very quickly, including competition authorities, saying what competitors can do and what they can't do together. And I think we should consider how we could make similar kind of exceptional efforts as regard climate crisis as we did as regards COVID. COVID crisis is about safeguarding people, especially seniors, and the functioning of public health in an immediate emergency situation. Climate crisis is about protecting our children and grandchildren and the future generations and the globe.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think all those comments just really amplify how important this topic is and how much we really need to be thoughtful about it. The title of the session was about sustainability, which I think we've now explored, and doing that within the framework of the horizontal or maybe other rules of the game. Suzanne, will you talk us through what those rules are and what do they really have to do with the environment and climate change?
Sure, Anna. Yeah, so I might just kind of set the scene and for the rest of the discussion in that way. And really, I think most of us know that as competition professionals, that really the narrative around the past 2 decades in competition policy within Europe and also particularly in the US has been that the conventional wisdom is that competition law should be insulated from environmental concerns. And this has come from regulators, but also from scholars. And so we're familiar with that narrative that competition law should be all about consumer welfare and maximizing economic efficiency. And this idea that non-economic public policy goals shouldn't be taken into account. And perhaps with the exception of state aid, that task should be a matter for the legislature. And again, I think we're familiar with this idea being present in, for instance, in the EU, in a variety of the European Commission's guidelines. One can think of the 2004 guidelines, the 1013 guidelines, for instance, and the 2011 horizontal cooperation guidelines. And each of those guidelines, as we know, emphasize that only objective economic efficiencies may be taken into account in applying 1013. To the exclusion of non-economic, including environmental benefits, going beyond any direct cost savings for consumers. And as we know, and as we'll discuss, the horizontal guidelines are currently in the process of being revised. And I think there is now a general consensus that one can see emerging that this approach requires urgent change. And for my own part, I think it's questionable whether it ever had any legitimate constitutional underpinning in the EU. And I think many would agree it certainly has none now. And we've moved on greatly since 2004. On the one hand, the environmental science has moved on. It's very clear, as Kirsi and Anneleen have already mentioned, there is acceptance that climate change poses an existential threat to the future of humanity. And globally, we shouldn't forget we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction of species also. And the evidence shows that these issues, in fact, now matter a great deal to EU consumers and therefore to businesses. But also, I think, second of all, it's beyond doubt now that private environmental initiatives must, in order for environmental policy to be effective, play a significant role in the policy mix. And this is an idea that has long been accepted in the Commission by DG Environment, for instance, and we're very familiar with it as consumers from examples like the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, the Carbon Divestiture Movement, for instance. And these kind of initiatives are based, I think, on this profound realization that it's no longer good enough to sit back and wait for the legislature to act. And as we'll discuss in a moment, there are many, many reasons why state action may not always be effective, or perhaps as effective as private action. So environmental problems do not always respect jurisdictional borders within which state works. So traditional conceptions of public and private regulatory functions, I think, which underpin this old approach are becoming fundamentally blurred. And we can see this recognition very clearly, for instance, in the May 2020 Farm to Fork strategy published by the European Commission as part of the European Green Deal, where the Commission envisages clarifying the competition rules for collective initiatives promoting sustainability in the supply chain, for instance. And we can also see it in the guidelines of the Dutch Competition Authority that Anna alluded to at the outset of this session. And we shouldn't forget that as corporations' power as environmental actors is being recognised, so too are their responsibilities. And we might think here of the wave of climate litigation that is taking place now in jurisdictions ranging from the US, Germany, Poland, for instance. And I think we have to ask ourselves, as competition professionals, are we prepared to accept that such corporations may reasonably argue that they were dissuaded from vital collective action due to the risk of competition enforcement? And I think the answer to that question must be a resounding no. In my own view, and we'll discuss this through the rest of the session, there is no convincing justification for the exclusion of environmental benefits from the competition assessment. I don't think constitutionally it is permitted in EU law by virtue of the environmental integration imperative in Article 11 TFEU. And I think there's nothing in the Court of Justice's case law supports it. And that's unsurprising because judges, of course, don't think in legal silos. And there's a really good example of that just in the September 2020 judgment of the Grand Chamber of the Court of Justice in the Hinkley Point case, which many of you may have come across. And in that case, the Court of Justice held, very importantly, that the Commission can't approve state aid, for instance, unless the project is compatible with environmental legislation. And the court relied on the environmental integration imperative in coming to that conclusion. So just to finish off here, one might suggest, for instance, that the court's classic solution in a case of conflict between environmental and economic treaty provisions is, of course, to apply a proportionality-based analysis. So this reasoning that we're all familiar with, whether there is a genuine legitimate aim, can that aim be achieved in a less restrictive way? And I would argue that such an approach is perfectly possible via Article 1013 TFEU. And indeed, you see this being developed in the Dutch Competition Authority's draft guidelines. In those guidelines, the authority looks at the idea of considering the environmental benefits to society at large and proposes that such benefits may offset competitive restrictions, including price increases. The authority also considers how benefits may be measured, and that is a difficulty in this area, we have to acknowledge it, and accepts that not just quantitative, but also potentially qualitative benefits may be taken into account here. And the authority also has a very interesting discussion of how we look at a fair share to consumers in this context, and accepts that one can include this share to consumers looking over the longer term. Although interestingly, it confines that to what it calls environmental damage agreements. And I think that concept is not perhaps entirely clear and perhaps needs to be worked out a little further. And the authority also looks at this idea that quantification could take place by putting what it calls environmental prices on pollution. So using this cost benefit technique that we already use in broader public economics. So there's some really interesting ideas in those draft guidelines. And again, that I think is all I wanted to say in terms of setting the scene, but I will hand back to you, Chair, at this moment.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think you've made the case for an active role for competition law on this topic very persuasively. But I guess that's one of the pieces of the debate that we wanted to explore further on this call. And I think, in fact, that we hear in the broader discussion around this with people saying this isn't really a competition law problem. Yes, we can see that it's there at the edges. You know, there's many other actors who have a greater responsibility to take this forward. Dina, Maria, given that you are at the competition authorities, would really welcome your thoughts on what is the proper role for the competition authorities as we go through this debate. I don't know who wants to start, Maria?
I can start, yes, and due to pick up a little bit on the very interesting and very valid point that Suzanne has already mentioned in that scene setter here. Of course, there is a role for industry to play in this fight against the climate change. And there is also a very important role to play for competition policy and competition enforcers, because at the end of the day, an effective and sound competition enforcement is often a prerequisite to ensure that the sustainability goals can be achieved in a timely and efficient manner. Or to put it even more simply, I think it is a role of competition enforcers to ensure that the market does not settle for something that is not as sustainable as it would be in a competitive market. I firmly believe that sustainability aspects will become an ever increasingly important parameters for customers, and we already see that trend. And I think we want the companies to compete on these parameters as they're competing on other quality and innovation parameters. Competition, we know, forces the company to listen to the market, and competition spurs innovation. And innovation is, of course, a key in order to address the climate change. So I think competition policy definitely has a role to complement and support this overall policy. I think there are 2 points from my perspective as a competition enforcer that we should bear in mind in this debate. And the first one is, of course, that we need to avoid falling into the greenwashing trap. So that sustainability is mainly used as a pretext for limiting or avoiding certain competition. Because at the end of the day, as sad as it is, we keep on seeing examples in our cartel enforcement and that company has used industry cooperation to actually collude on avoiding or slowing down the rollout of more environmental friendly alternatives. And we of course need to make sure that we have a system that allows us to continue to fight any such attempts very forcefully. And for that, we need an effective and we need a sufficiently predictive enforcement system. And that is perhaps my second point. We should definitely not shy away from an informed debate on whether our rules and our goals of competition policy stands in the way of sustainability goals, especially in the environmental but we also need to show that if we were to identify any such shortcomings, then we need to find solutions that would still allow us to do the core tasks of the competition enforcers, to ensure that we do not jeopardize the effectiveness and the coherence of competition enforcement. And that is particularly important in an environment such as the EU, where we have a large family of competition enforcers. And more importantly, we have millions and millions of companies of different shapes and sizes that have to self-assess their operations. So I fully agree with everything that has been said by my fellow panelists here. Sustainability, especially focusing on the climate change, is extremely important. And that's why we have already for a while exchanged ideas within the European competition network on how we should assess cooperation between competition enforcers. I will hand over and let Dina deal a little bit with that one, but just the last 20 seconds on my side is to say that I'm happy to see that the discussion that we already had within the European competition network is now also being enlarged in other competition enforcers fora. We had the first sustainability discussion in a panel in the ICN about a month ago that I also had the privilege of taking part in. And there is a sustainability discussion coming up now also in the competition arm of the OECD. And I think that this is a clear signal that shows the importance from the competition enforcer side as well, that this is a topic that we must invest in, and we have a lot to learn from each other. But over to you, Dina.
Indeed, Maria, a lot has already been said. And I think what this debate shows is that apart from the fact that the debate that Suzanne was in 2011 apparently has now really taken up globally, what I also see is that I think it has also moved significantly from a polarization type of debate into a debate where we're trying to find indeed a sustainable way of how to integrate those two. So I think we really are at this junction now. And within the ECN debate has been ongoing, and the Dutch guidelines have already been mentioned. There is also a discussion paper by the Hellenic Competition Commission, which also is a very elaborate document, which apart from the analysis and a very supportive view of sustainability inclusion, it also provides some of actual possible solutions in a more administratable manner. I'm saying the advice unit that comprises experts from competition agency as well as other agencies to advise the parties. It also talks about possible usage of sandboxes, so actually using some kind of sustainability agreements in a more controlled environment without a risk of a fine. So again, something that I think we will be discussing eventually. There are initiatives in other member states. So the French agency has already signed a memorandum with other partners in the country addressing sustainability issues. There has also been debate in Germany, which has published a document which is a little bit more, one can say, conservative on this. But I think this trying to polarize who is more or less conservative, I don't think it's bringing us anywhere far. What I think we really are at is a junction of how to integrate, and the debate has really shifted into understanding that there are a lot of ways where there really is no polarization at the very beginning, and there are a lot of aspects, and I thought I'd just touch upon two that I found interesting, and one is more technical and one is more general. So the more technical one is the question of willingness to pay. That is the one that is often being addressed as something to be assessed. The willingness of a consumer to pay for the sustainability benefit, potentially at the expense of the price increase that the consumer would incur. And my thoughts of that are, well, first of all, there was a report that was mentioned, that a survey that says that there was 1 in 5 consumers that were willing to pay for the sustainability solutions. Well, if we're talking of willingness to pay, the way I see it is, well, then that means it's a competition parameter. If there is a willingness to pay, then we as competition authorities would be dealing with it, I guess, in a manner as we deal with other competition parameters, either price or quality or innovation, and we've been doing that. And we've been improving that for a while now, taking into consideration the changes in the market. So there is really no real tension there. Where I do see a tension, for example, is if we are facing a situation where consumer willingness to pay really differs on a territorial basis. And that might definitely happen, and that's where we started. I'm sure that that consumers in Finland might be more willing to pay for some sustainable solutions than consumers in other parts of the EU. And if that's the measurement, are we sure that as competition authorities, we would take the right decision when we consider willingness to pay as the sign of what's sustainable or not, or what outweighs the sustainability, the price effects of a particular sustainability agreement? So I would say this, while on the one hand really gives the competition authorities the tools to deal with it in some aspects, it also could result in some patchwork if we don't move to a more uniform solution in some point. Coming back to another alternative, if there really is no willingness to pay from the consumer side, then what I would see is, well, that means there is really no demand. And if there is no demand, I'm not sure what's the role of competition authorities here. Because if there is a demand, if there's a lack of demand, then I would say there is a market failure. And if there is a market failure, as in many other cases, we go to regulation for that. So, and when we think about it, the same demand failures we have with the privacy debate. And I think one of the lessons that we learned from that is that there really is a significant role that regulation should play, and something where competition authorities really don't seem to be well placed for that. And that brings me to the more general aspect, is the effectiveness of competition policy, which Maria has already mentioned, and just the ability of competition agencies to assess things like that. Because where there is no consumer demand, I would say we're going into more of a non-expert, a political arena. And as a non-political actors, query, are we well placed to take those decisions? And I would just give one example, and I understand that I'm being at risk of being understood as not being sensitive to the fact that environmental concerns are much more important, maybe, or maybe I could be seen as oversimplifying things. But I think sometimes the simple examples really raise the questions better. So the example is the case of agreement between Lithuanian beer producers to limit production of strong beers. I know it would have sounded better if I discussed about it in Brussels in person, but let's just skip that. So the debate was taking place in Lithuania as to the problem we're having with the health problem we're having with significant usage of strong alcohol, but there was no legislative solution to that. And at some point, the major producers decided to join and agree to limit production of strong beer. And the discussion was taking place, what strength of the beer would be the one to be limited. And then the agreement was adopted, and the competition authority looked at it. And we found, well, that this could be a limitation of production on part of competitors. But the argument that was brought to us was, well, this is for the health benefit of society. And if we don't do that, then Lithuanians would die of health problems because of consumption of strong alcohol. Again, I'm really sorry for oversimplifying and for bringing this with the environmental debate that we're having. But the discussion was, so we're sitting there as a competition authority thinking whether a 9 percentage point alcohol per volume is the risky level as opposed to 8 or 10. And I'm not sure what's the right answer there, especially given that we had even evidence of internal documents that were saying that well, let's actually choose 9 because 8 was still a profitable one. So is this really a health solution? But I think the question is even not that. The question is, are we sure the competition agencies are good at making societal value judgments? And I think this risk is really there. Is in particular, again, going back to the potential patchwork of enforcement I think the values across countries, as much as we're trying to align them in many ways, they are still different. And when we think of the newer members of the EU, I think it took a while for the competition agencies, and in particular the judiciary, who were trained in with a more socialist background, to even take upon the free market as a value. So trying to balance a value of competition as a free market versus environmental efficiency would potentially lead to very different decisions across the EU. And just to close this point, in 2017, the Director General at the time, Mr. Leitenberger, was saying, when he was discussing competition versus other societal matters, he said that there is no reason to shy about the overall impact of competition law. And let's be ambitious instead, he said. And I would agree with that, but I think, thinking what I've just discussed, I think I'd add, let's be ambitious and sustainable. Because I think the biggest mistake that we could make, and I think that's what Maria also mentioned, is to lose the benefits that protecting competition brings to sustainability, which is the role that I think we're actually expert at playing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, and to both to Dina and to Maria, who I think have set out some of the positive ways in which competition authorities have a role here, but also, of course, some of the limitations that might come into that. I mean, I think one of the responses to those limitations that we hear a lot is that actually this would be better done by regulation, that this shouldn't be a competition problem. But Kirsi, Suzanne, would welcome your thoughts on that. Can we rely on can we rely on competition authorities, or is this really a regulatory issue? Maybe Kirsi, you can kick us off.
Well, I agree completely that the primary means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is government regulation. The reason why we need regulation is precisely that consumer demand does not yet always provide sufficient incentives to produce low carbon goods, because this is precisely the unwillingness to pay of the consumers. If there was willingness to pay by the consumers, so then we wouldn't even need regulation, because competition between firms would take care of this problem. But as this is not the case, we need regulation. And this is, of course, also what economists tell us, that according to economic theory, this kind of negative externality, like polluting the globe, should be dealt with regulation. And putting an appropriate price on carbon by means of regulation should lead both consumers and businesses to switch away from high carbon goods and services and push companies to invest in low carbon alternatives. However, the problem here is that, at least for the time being, regulatory measures are not tight enough to promote the necessary change. The payments for allowance rights are too low to solve this negative externality, at least quickly enough. And if there was a centralized decision-making body in the world, we could quickly fix this by regulating worldwide. However, despite the results of the US elections, we are of course far away from effective international regulation. And the problem is that we simply do not have the time to wait to save the planet. The economic theory that says that negative externalities should be dealt with by regulation is a fine theory, but we are facing something which is very different from all other problems, and this is why I say we should set aside this from rest of the problems. This is question of the future of the globe, of the future generations. And here, because of course we need to always, when we look at whether horizontal cooperation between companies could help here, we need to be sure that we do not take away the incentive of individual companies to compete against each other to provide more and more sustainable products. But this doesn't mean that at some points it wouldn't be good also that the companies could cooperate in a horizontal way. It is difficult to assess this. I completely agree. I think the national authorities are not very well placed to do this. But I think this is so important that we need the guidelines from the Commission that says how we make the distinction between good cooperation and bad cooperation, when this is good from point of view of sustainability that companies do cooperate, and when it is not. And this also deals with the question that whether we might get different decisions across Europe. I think that the Commission should, at least in the beginning, be very centralized as regards like guidelines or even making the decisions. So I do think that regulation is best. I do think that competition is best, but this still leaves the question at which situations cooperation between companies is best, and we need guidelines for that.
Thank you. And Suzanne, your thoughts on that, the role of regulation?
Thanks, Anna. And yes, I would really agree with what Kirsi has just said. Of course, there's a role for regulation, and indeed, we know, again, the classic narrative has been that this should solely be for the legislator and not for competition, for the reasons that have been outlined. We don't want to pollute competition or kind of distract competition enforcers from what their primary goal is, and this could lead to inefficiencies overall and ineffectiveness. And of course, that has been the narrative for some time. But I think just to respond briefly to the points that Dina was raising, I think we can categorize those points as in broad terms. Firstly, concerns about the potential politicization or moving beyond the expertise of the competition enforcer on the one hand, and then concerns as to administrability on the other hand, and the difficulty of measuring. And those are valid concerns, and of course we have to recognize them. But I think we have to move away from this idea that there's a binary choice between the reliance on regulation or then the use of competition policy, and instead move to a vision where, in fact, we are relying on a mixture of regulation then that is supported by a coherent and consistent competition policy that is in line with the regulatory goals. Just on the politicization point, I don't think it is the case that, as one might kind of imagine when one thinks about being left these decisions as competition enforcers, that one is kind of forced to be looking for environmental answers as a non-expert body without any solutions potentially or sources to draw on. In fact, I think what you see is that the vast majority of issues in EU environmental law are already regulated for in some sense, or there is very clear guidance as to what the aims are at the EU level. And indeed now that is absolutely the case, given that we have this very strong European Green Deal narrative coming from the Commission. And as part of that, indeed, we see with the proposal for a European climate law that the European Commission will, if that passes, itself be obliged to act in accordance with achieving the climate target. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, well, in what justification would competition policy be excluded from that very powerful debate and obligation that is coming forward at the overall macroeconomic level, but the tying together the EU's macroeconomic policies and environmental policies, which again are already very well regulated. So I think as competition enforcers, we have a lot to go on already in the regulation that is already there if we're looking for environmental aims. And just then briefly on the administrability point, again, I see that point, but I really don't think that regulators can take the view that they are not able to perform a task simply because it may be difficult in circumstances where the law and the governance framework, in fact, requires them to step up. And we think about Article 1013 again, which clearly states that there must be balancing there, and indeed regulators are governed by that. It's difficult, it's not clear at all how that balancing might take place, but I don't think it's a good enough answer to say that it's too hard, so therefore we're just going to avoid the issue. Of course, there is a very strong case that indeed the guidance should be given at EU level by the Commission, which indeed the Commission, as we know, is now in the process of considering, so as to make the burden easier for national competition authorities. So those are the 2 points I just wanted to make. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, of course, the other key actor in all of this is private business. Anneleen, as counsel at business, what do you think the role is for private businesses on this topic?
I think, and listening to the debate, I think it's quite clear that businesses will have to lead this, right? Because I think there's simply no time to wait for regulation, especially transnational regulation that is required to tackle these challenges. And I think when you look at the challenges at hand and what is needed to actually solve them, I see two big needs, right? One is the need for information, and it's information on how are we currently producing things, how do markets really function, and information on how we can do this in a more sustainable way. And obviously businesses are the ones that have that information, and not just information on the actual production, but also information on how it is directly impacting their long-term viability. So how climate change is impacting the long-term viability. And if I look at my own company, if I look at AB InBev, to brew beer, you need water. And so we are one of the companies that is directly impacted by the fact that our water supply is drying up. So obviously we would be the drivers behind water stewardship and initiatives that look for how can we produce more sustainably and how can we produce beer in a way that requires less water. But because we immediately see it day to day how it is impacting us, and we see how it is impacting the world at large and the communities in which we operate. So I think there's that need for information, for which businesses are key because we have access to that information. And obviously there's a need for scale, because in order to tackle these challenges, as a smaller business or even as a group of businesses, you can't necessarily tackle it alone. And I think that is where competition law comes in, right? Because either you are a big player, and then immediately there's the word dominance in the background. You're a big player, and you, by changing your production methods yourself, you can have a measurable impact on sustainability. That's fine, but that also probably means that you will be forcing through some things in your supply chain where your suppliers or your customers may raise antitrust concerns. So I think obviously antitrust comes into play there. Or you're a smaller player and you want to cooperate with others, and that's where I think the evident focus of the debate is always on one-on-one cooperation, and obviously that's where antitrust comes in as well. And then there's vertical cooperation, so along your supply chain. And so I think for any initiative in any of these three ways, it will require some sort of alignment on competitive factors. So I think it's not so much a question of should antitrust authorities take these questions. It's not even a question. I think this will arise, and I think Dina is selling competition authorities a bit short in my view, because I think competition authorities have proven time and time again that they are perfectly equipped to school themselves in highly technical matters. I'm thinking of pharma, telecom, big tech. I mean, every market or every issue where antitrust was a thing, I think antitrust authorities have been capable of, familiarizing themselves with what the latest thinking is in the field, how everything works, and then how antitrust can be applied. And I think with sustainability, I echo very much what Suzanne is saying. There's so much thinking that's already been done. There's so many experts in the field. There's climate economists. So even when it comes to the quantification of harm, which is often raised as sort of a barrier, like, oh, how will we deal with this as antitrust practitioners? I think a lot of the models are already there for the taking. And in fact, maybe that even more so than in other areas and industries, that antitrust authorities have no trepidation to act in. So I do think that antitrust authorities are capable. Will it be perfect? Probably no. But then again, I don't think in any field antitrust enforcement is necessarily perfect, but I think that's fine. That's also why we have judges. And judges actually, I don't think, ever shy away from answering these questions, even though they may not be experts in any of those fields themselves. So long story short, I do think businesses will be at the forefront. I think that the type of cooperation that is required is already happening. Whether it always reaches antitrust authorities, that's another question. I think we'll touch upon that a bit later in the panel as well. So I think, yeah, it's more an invitation to antitrust authorities. Please take up the challenge, because it will be needed. And if it's not in a very active way, then at least in a passive way. So to not use cartel enforcement, for example, to block certain initiatives.
Thank you, Anneleen. I think that's really interesting. And if we have time, I definitely want to come on to some of the points you already talked about, which is, this is more than just horizontal cooperation. But one of the things you were teasing up there, I think, is a topic I wanted to come back to next, which is, what can we expect from the authorities? What are we going to see them doing? And I'd like to throw this first to Maria, because we've seen some action from the Commission in the last few months on this topic. What might we see from the Commission?
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me a little bit better. I had some problems with the sound the first time that I spoke, but I'll try to speak up now. Just to sort of tie a little bit to so to speak the previous speakers here, and repeat partly a little bit what I said before. As I said, legislation definitely has a role to play, but competition policy and competition enforcement also has a role to play to complement and to support, and to some extent also allow industry cooperation to lead the way in this debate. And I don't think there is any disagreement amongst us in that sense. The point that I was trying to make before is, of course, that we should also be a little bit mindful that private initiatives do not necessarily stand in the way de facto or de jure, also from legislative initiatives that may take a little bit longer but could reach even more sustainable outcomes. So that is a factor in addition to the underlying premise of what competition can do to achieve the sustainability goals that I just wanted to underline. But as has been hinted on several times, indeed, the European Commission is in a bit of a special animal in this debate as well, because we're not only a competition enforcer, we're also a part of the European Commission with much larger competences and much larger powers and much larger goals in that respect. And the Green Deal initiative is, of course, an extremely important element in the debate that we're having here, and to see how we concretely can complement and reinforce the different regulatory initiatives and legislative initiatives that will be part of that Green Deal exercise. And that is why, indeed, we have launched a reflection exercise exactly on this one. We have launched a call for contribution from stakeholders. It is still ongoing. The deadline is Friday next week. So anyone listening in on this one who have not yet thought about contributions, please do. Because the whole idea here is to gather ideas and proposals from a wide range of stakeholders. As we did with the digital reflection process in 2019, we also intend to have a conference early next year to bring all of these perspectives together. And the ideas and suggestions will then feed into a number of different legislative initiatives that we have ongoing. And of course, very much at the center of the debate we're having in this panel is the review of the horizontal block exemptions and the horizontal guidelines. As we know, they cover a large spectrum of different types of cooperation agreements, but for the time being, there is nothing specific on sustainability or environment. There's some very useful guidance already on standardization agreements, which of course is also very important for the one-on-one aspect of the sustainability debate. But it's clear from the consultation and the feedback that we have received on the horizontal review that stakeholders expect something more specific on sustainability issues. I think we received roughly 90 replies to our consultation, and half of them raised sustainability as something that we need to develop further. I think it's clear from the discussions that we're having in different fora that there is unfortunately a perception that competition law would block arrangements that we would actually find unproblematic. And it's obvious that we have a task to do to better clarify and be transparent in terms of what can be done, to break some of the myths that exists out there in terms of the benefits that can be taken into account and how we balance those benefits against the harm of certain arrangements. Because we do not only take into account economic benefits. The key of the matter is rather to find a system that would allow us to take non-quantifiable measures into account in a sufficiently predictable manner. Because at the end of the day, what I said is not a question of authorities not stepping up and gathering the skills that is needed to address complex issues. The question is of finding a framework and finding methods that would also allow companies to have that when they self-assess their arrangements. Because at the end of the day, that is what matters. The few cases that the competition authorities are dealing with is just the tip of the iceberg. So the key thing at this moment in time, and that is also very clear from the outreach that we're having on the Green Deal, is that we need to gather facts and experience. It's crucial that we have an understanding from the business realities in order to understand the scenarios that we want to foster and those scenarios that we want to avoid, so that we're not overly cautious in that. So what are the directions and the landing zones here? I fully agree that guidelines at an EU level would have obvious advantages. And we do hear, so to speak, the calls from that one coming from different corners. All that I want to say at this moment in time is that it's of course a delicate exercise to draft general guidance when you lack the experience. And even if some national competition authorities have a little bit more experience on these issues than what the European Commission has, it falls short of the type of experience that you need in order to draft helpful guidance. If you don't have the experience and if you don't have the insights from the industry, there is an obvious tendency that you will be overly cautious, that you will be overly risky, and that we would be overly general, and that it would not be helpful at this moment in time. So this is not just a placeholder from my side, this is simply a plea to say that now is the time to share the experience, exactly coming back to what was Anneleen said, share the experience on the business reality so that that can be taken into account. And the Commission has also throughout the last year made it absolutely clear that we are willing to also use tools that exist in our toolkit that had admittedly never been used in order to provide guidance even before there might be general guidelines on these issues. So that is to use the Article 10 decisions or the clearance decisions and the informal guidance letter instruments. This would allow us, of course, to take a view on a real-life example to some extent and provide far more details and provide far more context in a quicker manner than what we'll ever be able to do in any future guidelines. Kirsi already made the link to COVID beforehand. I don't think that we have changed our substantive rules or moved the goalpost during the COVID and the announcements that we have made, but indeed we have shown as a community of competition enforcers that we are willing to guide and lead the way and help companies also with individual arrangements that are important from the broader European perspective. So that is definitely something that we're willing to do. I think the perfect candidate for the first informal guidance letter and the first Article 10 decision would be an environmental agreement. The only thing that is lacking at this time is a request and the input that we need from the industry in order to take position on that one. Because that is where we can do our task of weighing complex issues together in a hopefully helpful way. So my bottom line here is really, if industry is truly holding back from entering into genuine sustainability initiatives, we urgently need to understand whether that is because our rules are not sufficiently clear, because that can easily be fixed, whether it is because our rules are in some instances too strict. That is a more tricky exercise, but of course that can also be fixed provided that the pros outweigh the cons.
Thank you, that's really helpful. I mean, that sort of gives us very much the Commission's perspective. Kirsi already touched on the role of the Commission in relation to the national competition authorities. I'd like to come to you and then to Dina, please, on the national competition authority position on this. I think we can't hear you, Kirsi. I don't know if you can unmute. Let's go to Dina first. I think we're having a technical problem on Kirsi's end, so let's start that way and hopefully we can bring you back in shortly.
Sure. I think indeed the role of, as I've mentioned, I think what we would really risk is having a patchwork of enforcement in an area that is much more global than the national or regional. At the same time, a lot of initiatives are still taking place on a national level, and the role of national competition authorities, I think, is still there. And just as Maria mentioned, indeed, we have all moved from the discussion of either competition or sustainability. But indeed, we do not have enough experience, and I think we have to be open about that. And I guess one of the important messages that at this junction, where we are actually in a junction of a debate, I think the important message could be the openness, both from competition authorities about our openness to hearing the situation on the market and the concerns that are out there, and both through the call that the Commission has launched, but also directly to competition agencies, I think. But I also think that there should be, in a way, and maybe this whole debate will lead to more openness on the part of the advisors, because the question, I think, is valid: how much of the real or perceived threat the competition law seems to be bringing to sustainability debates, how much of that is a result of overly cautious advice on the part of the advisors? Because it was interesting. I dug up the old horizontal guidelines, and even there was this rule on provision of environmental agreements that already there was quite explicit about the fact that many of them really are unlikely to fall into Article 101 at all, without even going to the discussion whether they fulfill the exemption criteria under 101.3. So maybe the fact that if it's not in the current guidelines, maybe that for some reason sent a wrong message that the thought is not there. But I don't think that there are a lot of agreements that would not fall into 101 altogether, their national equivalent. I think apart from the openness, another thing that is really important is the prioritization tool. And that is something that is also part of the ECN Plus that is being transposed now. And I think by prioritizing cases that, for example, would focus on exclusionary behaviors that limit access to some sustainable technology or sustainability inducing technology, or actually going after sustainability reducing agreements, that is a priority decision that competition agencies could take to make sure they are playing a stronger role in sustainability. But that also means not launching investigations in cases which seem, on what maybe the Dutch call the more qualitative assessment, seem not not to be problematic or be more sustainability enhancing. So I think the prioritization option is really there, and this debate would allow us as competition agencies to benefit from that even better. And even for other societal tools, and there was this debate on gender equality in competition law, and one of the tools there as well is prioritizing, and for example prioritizing markets that allow women to play a more significant role on the market. Again, it's a very clarified way of how competition agencies can promote a societal value that is not part of the narrow competition the way we see it. So I think openness, both in terms of, on both sides, also in terms of learning how we can, be best placed in that. And I agree, Anneleen, with there's a lot of things that we can learn, and there's a lot of environmental economic tools that we could use, and we, as we've used in all other markets. I think the question is having enough evidence and being open to see where we are really talking of a value judgment, and maybe leaving that not to competition authorities. But a lot of things are really not value judgments. There really are things that could be assessed, and there I think we as competition authorities have our place.
Thank you. Hopefully Kirsi's mic is now working, if she can also give a view from the national authority side, but that was really helpful. Thank you, Dina.
I hope you hear me now. My microphone stopped working all of a sudden. I very much welcome that the Commission is active and that it has made this part of the Green Deal and has opened consultation and asks for contributions from the industry. And I do hope that the industry now takes this opportunity. I think the most important question for competition policy to solve is to provide analytical framework as to how benefits and detrimental effects of this kind of cooperation between rivals to promote sustainability should be assessed. As at the moment, how I interpret the present guidelines is that the rivals are not allowed to cooperate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if this does not benefit the consumers in the markets where cooperation takes place, and that the key is the willingness to pay of consumers. And I mean, this means that the benefit of consumers outside the relevant market are not taken into account. And I do not believe personally that the European Court of Justice would interpret the law so narrowly. The case law of the Court of Justice takes a pretty broad interpretation of what is consumer benefit, and I think that the treaty and the case law of the European Court of Justice not only allows us to look at environmental sustainability agreements from the point of view of wider perspective, but also mandates us to do so. But of course, as has been said earlier, we need to analyze carefully when cooperation really promotes sustainability and when it can even destroy individual incentives of the firms to do better than others. But I think it's very important that the European Commission gives clear guidance for national authorities. This task of analyzing the benefits and downsides of environmental sustainability agreements is too difficult for national authorities. I recognize that it's difficult for the Commission also, but we need the guidance.
Thank you. And Anneleen, I'd like to come to you now, please. So we've heard from the Commission, we've heard from national authorities of what we might expect from them. Is that what businesses need? Is that what businesses want?
Yes. And I think it's been said before on this panel, obviously for business, the more consistency, the better, especially in this arena, because as we already discussed, the challenges cross borders, and the solutions will also be cross borders. So it can't be that one authority analyzes an agreement in one way and then another authority would look at it differently. So I think everyone is clear on that. Second, I would say, as usual, the clearer the guidance, the better. I fully appreciate the challenge, especially in an area where there may not be that many precedents just yet. And I think there's, coming from the business side, I think there's almost a little bit of an elephant in the room, right? I think Kirsi already highlighted the need to have a clear framework on how benefits will be analyzed. But if you really think about it, I think, at least from a business perspective, demonstrating 101(3) benefits, or even adducing an objective justification defense in an antitrust case, or bringing an efficiencies claim in a merger context. I think there's this belief, at least among businesses, that you should never bank on that ever being effective, right? So, and I think for as long as that kind of thinking is out there, even with all the guidelines, I think it will be difficult to convince companies to take the risk. Yes, enter into 101(1) agreement, and then you can go and explain it afterwards if you show this and this and this. I think no company would want to take the risk, especially given the penalties. So I think that's a real challenge to overcome. And there are a lot of things that will need to be clarified in order to overcome that, because we highlighted already the benefit to consumers, to what consumers, and I saw someone was asking a question in the Q&A on that too. Can we think about future consumers, which I think is a super interesting question. And then the whole question around, but what if it leads to price increase? And that goes to Dina's point also on willingness to pay. I think coming from an FMCG company with very established brands, I also see there's a difference between if you would launch an innovation, so a completely new product, and you put it in the market. I can see how there would be a willingness to pay for that, and you can market it as a more sustainable alternative and all of that. But I think the real challenge will be, how will we deal with a situation where it's clear that it's a more environmentally sustainable product, but it's an existing product, and it will just become more expensive? And I think a lot of that debate has been going on, aside from the antitrust debate, for example, on air travel. And I think there the consumer willingness to pay, I think, is drastically lower. I think it's going to be much more difficult to convince consumers to give up something that they've already enjoyed for a while. I do think there may be a solution in the way we look at it in tech markets, where I think the notion that sometimes you need companies to create a demand rather than waiting for a demand to emerge and then having the market regulate itself and or being regulated by that demand. I think that notion is already there. And I think it would be useful to explore whether we can use some of that thinking also to the sustainability area, because I, for one, see that is often driving companies to want to have binding horizontal agreements, because there's a disadvantage for the first mover to make their existing products more expensive because, for example, they eliminate plastic in their packaging, right? So if you then have an industry-wide binding commitment that everyone will reduce plastic in their packaging, I'm just using this it's a hypothetical example. But if you would have that, then that kind of resets, you set the demand for it, right? Because you take away the alternatives. Obviously, as an antitrust practitioner, it's like it's an inherent antitrust question: should we allow this? But I think if we don't allow this, and we let the market and demand regulate what suppliers are doing, I don't think we will get very far.
Thank you.
And then I had a final point, which I really liked actually in the Dutch guidance, which is their open door policy. But I would make a caveat. So for those of you who haven't read the guidelines, it's this idea that you could just walk into the authority and say, look, this is what we want to do. What do you think about it? Which is actually going, stepping away from the self-assessment. And I think in multiple forums, that idea has already been floated. I'm all for it. I think the devil there will also be in the detail, and it's going to be in how much trust will there be between the authority and the businesses in front of them, that one of the information supplied is true and accurate, and on the other hand, that whatever is said will never be used against the companies, right? I think there's there's a trust issue that I think will need to be solved for that to be super effective. But I do believe it can be an extremely powerful tool.
Thank you. We had one other topic we wanted to discuss, but I'm conscious of time and giving everybody an opportunity for questions. We've touched on it already in the discussion so far, but there has been a really interesting question that's come through already, and any others, please do put your hands up and I'll come to you. Kirsi's given some initial reflections on it already, but I do think it's a really thought-provoking idea in terms of where is the offset between harm and benefit, and I think in different ways we've touched on that already in the panel. In terms of, let's take a hypothetical that there is a cooperation that results in a price increase. How willing is competition law to offset that price increase against benefits which don't pertain to the consumer of the product where the price goes up? And then that has a kind of a parallel, a sort of different markets component. And the interesting thing in the question is a temporal one. Can we sustain price increase now for the benefit of future generations? And I think there is a question both of can and should. So can it do that? Should it do that? And I think Kirsi has already given an unequivocal answer that yes, it should do that. But I welcome views either from Kirsi and others from the panel of, do we have those tools already? Are we able to make that offset now?
I think at the moment we really need more guidance on this, because I think that we should take into account future generations, but the present guidance, it will be difficult to do that. But I think, I mean, all the discussion that we have had today, so I really want to one more time say that this is so different from any other problem. This is question of the future of the globe, the question of our children, our grandchildren, the future generations. So I think we really have to do something now. The consumer demand now is not sufficient to correct this problem. Regulation is not enough. So competition authorities have to do all they can and take into account the future generations.
Thank you. I haven't seen any other questions coming from the audience, so I'll come back to one of my questions, which was about other angles to this. And I wanted to come straight to you, Anneleen, if I can, about mergers. Is there a mergers angle here, or is the tolerance for, or should it be different in a cooperation context and a merger context?
Well, I think in a merger context, I think I'm going to make a more general point, actually. So if in a merger context, companies would want to raise inefficiencies defense related to sustainability, I think the way that should be analyzed should be similar as how we look at objective justifications under 102 or under benefits under 101.3. So for me, I think that is key. And in the merger context too, one of the additional challenges, and actually we touched, the person who asked the question touched upon it maybe unknowingly, but it's a time horizon that we use to take into account effects of a merger, right? Because it could be, if you think about, I don't know, again, purely hypothetical example, if you have two companies, number one and number two in wind power, for example, and they merge, and they can show that, but within 60 years, it will lead to a complete transformation of the energy provision in Europe. Is that sufficient to offset this very short-term impact of a reduction of competition on that market? And I think it's going to be very difficult to give clear guidelines for scenarios like that, because it's going to be so fact specific. But I do think thinking around what time horizon do we take into account for sustainability efficiencies to become visible or to arise, I think that is a super important one, because I think that could well be one of the, I mean, that would be a big departure, I think, from current precedent and thinking around time horizons.
Thank you. And Maria, if I can come to you, does the Commission see this as just a horizontal issue, or does the Commission see it more broadly?
Commission certainly sees it more broadly, and that is also clear from the mere fact that the Green Deal outreach and the public consultation that we have pending until next week covers all the free instruments. It covers mergers and state aid and antitrust, and under antitrust is certainly not limited only to 101, but there are 1 or 2 angles there as well. So that is obvious. I mean, state aid is a little bit of a special animal, although just to mention here that, of course, in state aid we already have success stories in how competition policy has been embedded in legislative actions. And the whole transition to renewable energy is a good example of that one. And that is perhaps one dimension that should also not be forgotten in this debate, that we as legislator as well can use, so to speak, the competition principles to ensure that we have a well-crafted and efficient legislation on those issues. And just a bit of a final comment, picking up a little bit on the issues in terms of points to reflect upon also in the 101 analytical framework. I mean, we have mentioned, so to speak, possibilities of taking out-of-market efficiency into account in certain situations, and we have mentioned, so to speak, the time horizon, who are actually the customers and what is a fair share of the customer's benefit. And just to underline there as well, that I think it's already clear from the existing 101 free guidelines that we do take into account future benefits for current customers. So I'm not sure that the step to also take into account long-term benefits for repeat purchases or for fully new consumers, etc., is in itself a big step to take. So there is a lot that we can elaborate with already within our existing framework without necessarily changing that existing framework. And this is, again, to repeat my mantra of this panel, we can't do this in isolation in our own little ivory tower. We need to understand what the business realities are. And to that extent, I think we have sent as clear signals as we can that we are open to discuss with the industry. And the mere fact that we have 2 ongoing legislative initiatives for the time being is a golden opportunity to come forward and talk to us now and give us that information in that context. Because at the end of the day, without undermining the importance and the difficult tasks that a judge would have, a judge use rules on the facts of a case in front of them. When the competition authorities take a decision, or when we draft guidelines, we intend to give guidance for many different situations than the one that we are dealing with upfront. And that is extremely important to bear in mind, that certain complex exercises can be done in an individual case, but at the end of the day, we need to have a system that works in a self-assessment basis and that works with also the possibilities for the other competition enforcers in our family. And that's why the more understanding we have on the business realities and understanding whether that can all be accommodated in the current rules, and it's just a question of clarifying the rules, the better.
Thank you so much. We've had one more question just in the chat, but in fact, we've now had a few more questions, but I think we're going to run out of time, not least because I'm committing to handing over to Nicola as well to introduce the book. Perhaps we might take those offline. We had a few more topics that we wanted to discuss as a panel, including in relation to the relationship with verticals and 102 and the interface with 106. I'm sorry to the panelists and indeed to the broader audience, we won't have time for those. Because I think this topic is one we can just continue to discuss. So I think what's left for me is to thank our panelists who have been fascinating for me, and I hope for everybody else as well. This topic is so important. I think we all agree on that. It really is a golden opportunity is a phrase that's been mentioned many times for us to try and tackle this now, and it would be a pity if we didn't do so. And if the energy of the 5 panelists is any reflection of the strength of feeling on this topic more broadly, I am confident that we will seize this golden opportunity. So thank you again.